Welcome to this explainer. Today we're jumping right into an absolute masterclass on the totally unforgiving nature of chemical logistics. We're going to focus on a highly specific, highly volatile challenge, and that is the safe transport of MDI and TDI. These are two critical chemical components known as diisocyanates. Now, transporting these chemicals, it isn't just about moving liquid from point A to point B. It actually requires this flawless choreography of engineering, chemistry, and strict human discipline. If you operate in the supply chain or you manage logistics risk, well, this is going to completely change how you look at a simple drop of water. Okay, let's just dive right in. 5.45. I really want that number to sink in for a second. That is the exact number of extra bar of CO2 pressure generated inside a closed 25 cubic meter tank container by just 20 kilograms of water. I mean, think about that. In the massive scale of industrial bulk transport, 20 kilograms of water is virtually nothing. It's basically a minor puddle. But when that tiny amount of moisture mixes with a cargo like TDI, the chemical reaction generates over 27 cubic meters of carbon dioxide gas. That creates 5.45 bar of extra pressure, quite literally stretching the heavy steel shell of the container from the inside out, threatening to violently burst the tank wide open. But you know, the pressure? That's actually only half the nightmare. The real danger comes in the form of polyuria. When MDI or TDI reacts with water, it doesn't just create gas, it creates this incredibly stubborn substance. You absolutely cannot think of polyuria as just some harmless chemical byproduct. You need to picture it as an inert, concrete-like glue. It forms this impermeable, completely insoluble crust. When this reaction happens inside a tank, it creates a literal ticking time bomb, coating the interior walls and sensitive equipment in a rock-hard layer that is incredibly difficult to remove without some serious, heavy mechanical force. So what this all boils down to is what we call the one-drop threat. The margins for error here are literally microscopic. A single drop of free water in a container doesn't just disperse safely. No, it initiates a rapid, compounding chemical reaction right at the surface of the liquid, forming those solid masses and off-gassing CO2. In this specific sector of logistics, a microscopic mistake in moisture control doesn't just degrade the product you're shipping, it initiates a macro, potentially catastrophic mechanical failure of the transport equipment itself. So let's look at how this builds into the core operational regulations. This brings us to Pillar 2, Equipment Law. When we pit top discharge directly against bottom valves, a massive contrast emerges. Now, in standard liquid transport, bottom valves are everywhere, right? But for MDI and TDI, bottom valves are universally condemned. Remember that polyuria we just talked about, that concrete glue? Well, if moisture gets into a bottom valve, the isocyanates react, and the polyuria solids will literally glue the valve shut. If that valve gets contaminated and starts leaking on a fully loaded tank, the solid blockage makes it nearly impossible to safely close or repair. It's a massive, massive risk. Because of that, top load and top discharge is the absolute law. To prevent that moisture ingress and the subsequent mechanical nightmare, all fittings for TDI and MDI transport must strictly be positioned on the top of the tank. By keeping the valves above the liquid line, you're drastically reducing their sensitivity to moisture, you're lowering the risk of spills during transit, and you protect the fittings from physical damage while the truck is rolling down the road. It's essentially a structural safeguard against the chemistry we just discussed. But even with the absolute best equipment, human ingenuity can sometimes kind of backfire. Let's look at a really common mistake, the dry air trap. Here is exactly how this trap unfolds. Say a driver needs to pressurize the tank to unload the chemical. They run the truck's standard air compressor, naturally assuming that the attached silica gel filter is going to dry the air. But here's the critical flaw. Within just 10 minutes, that compressed air easily hits 70 degrees Celsius. This hot airflow hits the silica gel filter, and instead of being dried by it, the heat actually regenerates the silica gel. It forces it to release all the moisture it had previously trapped. So the well-intentioned operator ends up pumping hot, wet air directly into the highly reactive cargo, literally baking moisture right into the MDI or TDI. So, what's the fix? Well, the solution here is super strict and specific. Facilities must completely bypass the truck's compressor. The consignee has to supply pressurized dry air or nitrogen, but not just any dry air. It must have a dew point strictly below minus 20 degrees Celsius to guarantee virtually zero water content, and the pressure must never, ever exceed 2 bar. Honestly, it's the only way to ensure the chemical remains entirely untainted by atmospheric moisture during discharge. All right, we've covered the chemistry and the equipment. Now let's explore our third pillar, safe operations and the human element. because these invisible reactions create some very immediate health hazards for the people actually handling the cargo. The ISOPA guidelines mandate highly precise PPE standards, and there's a distinct difference when you're dealing with TDI. While MDI requires strict PPE, like chemical gloves and safety boots, TDI is incredibly volatile. If a worker is making a connection, dealing with a spillage, or handling TDI in any way, the guidelines strictly mandate a full face mask with specific AP2 filters, alongside a full chemical suit. The vapors are highly hazardous, so your standard safety goggles simply won't cut it here. Which leads us to a critical, literal, life-saving operational mandate, the PPE cabin rule. Just imagine a driver finishes unloading and hops back into their truck. If there is a small, completely undetected drop of isocyanate on their glove or their boot, it doesn't just sit there. It reacts with the ambient moisture in the air and immediately begins to off-gas. In the confined small space of a truck cabin, that single invisible drop can rapidly cause the air to exceed safe occupational exposure levels, toxifying the very air the driver breathes. Therefore, all PPE must be completely removed and stored outside the driver cabin. No exceptions. And there is a fascinating, highly counterintuitive safety rule regarding that contaminated gear. If you have a glove with MDI on it, you'd naturally think you should seal it up tight in a waste bin to contain the hazard, right? Actually, scratch that. The strict rule is the exact opposite. Contaminated PPE bins must never be tightened shut. Why? Because that isocyanate is reacting with moisture, it is continuously producing CO2 gas. If you seal that bin, you're basically building a pressurized bomb. The bin absolutely must be allowed to vent. So, why do we have all these relentless, highly technical regulations? Well, it all comes down to our final point, the ultimate goal. And that goal is to make things boring. I want to anchor our conclusion with this really powerful quote from Amit K., an expert in tank containers. He says, "The tank container did not eliminate risk, it reorganized it. It shifted responsibility from manual handling to engineering integrity." This perfectly captures the modern philosophy of hazardous transport. We no longer rely on hundreds of waterfront laborers perfectly handling individual drums. We're relying on flawless engineering, rigid inspection protocols, and a completely closed-loop system. And that brings us to the core takeaway for today. Boring is the goal. When these three pillars, the chemistry, the equipment law, and the strict operational safety are deeply respected, the global chemical network functions so smoothly that the inherent danger practically vanishes from view. Tens of thousands of these tanks circulate globally, entirely untouched from loading to discharge. Strict compliance makes this highly dangerous transport so inherently safe that for the executives involved, commercial freight cost becomes the only visible variable they even have to think about. So I'll leave you with this final thought to evaluate your own operations. Is your supply chain truly engineering out the risk through strict adherence to these technical guidelines? Or by maybe ignoring a single drop of water or a faulty truck compressor, are you just hiding a ticking time bomb? Take a really close look at your moisture control protocols and ensure your logistics are as boring and as safe as they should be. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.